So I have with me yet again my regular guest, Laure Jackson, who is back to talk about all of your sensory issues. Now, last week I said sensory stuff because I didn't quite know how to describe what it is that you do, but I think I've learned something, which is great. And we've had some questions and comments. So thank you for joining me once again here on the Get You Home show.
Oh, it's great to be here. Looking forward to the questions too.
Jolly good. Let's just dive in, shall we? I've got some very different strands. So this one, both anonymous, they email me separately. So this is someone who's had some struggles with his brain. He is classed as having brain, let me get this right so I don't misread him. He is classed as having a brain injury because he had cancer many years ago. And he said, this is his question, the main issues are coping with memory caused by low processing levels and fatigue. The question is how to cope with that and how to cope with folk not understanding it. Is there anything Anne might be able to do to help me?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, I think to start with, it's good to make the clarification that this isn't a technical sensory processing issue in the way that we would deal with those who have developmentally developed that way, as it were. You know, so for the children that are coming in, we would typically see sensory processing issues as a result of just the way that the brain has formed or hasn't really connected. So we can use specific sensory integration and processing strategies and therapies to get those connections working better. However, the best thing is about our brain is that even if we have an injury, we can still use certain strategies. We can't do the same types of therapy, but we can use a lot of that common sense that we know from the neuroscience and apply it to practicalities. So with someone with a brain injury, that is a different approach, and there are different strategies, different ways in that we would use with those. But yeah, absolutely. Any kind of assault on the brain is going to affect processing. So so it sounds like he has a lower processing speed and memory retention, possibly. It would be interesting to see if he is able to ascertain which types of memory so that we can focus on ones that might have some areas of strength. So he might be better at visual memory. So it would be writing things down and having things up so that he can actually see things rather than hear things. So he would have visual prompts for his memory of things to do, the same way that many of us would write a shopping list or something. We've got it there as a visual prompt. Other people would be better recording things on their phone so that it's there as an auditory prompt of things that they need to remember and need to do. So there would be a lot of what we class as cognitive strategies. So there's lots of those strategies that involve clever thinking. So he needs to think cleverly around the areas that he struggles with. So we're finding what are the areas of his memory aren't that great. And whether it be visual memory, auditory memory, he might find that smells trigger off better memories, and he can associate smells and put smells into place to help him remember certain things. He could certainly do what we class as those visual timetables. That's often a great one for those who have more auditory, so that the hearing, if they don't process things so well through their hearing, we like to write those pictures, whether we take photographs of the order of things in the order in which things need to be done. So if he's trying to make himself a meal, then he'd actually make sure that he has would have a recipe. It's clear, it's all laid out for him. And the same thing would be actually if there's a memory issue getting dressed, that you would want to put those pictures out of the order of getting dressed. Or if he's in work, what are the things that he needs to do, and making sure that he has those visual structures in place to be able to follow them, or put in those auditory structures, or smell, or that he has little tactile prompts. So it's just trying to use as many of the different senses as possible to connect with him. The lower processing speed is trying to slow things down on the computer, make things bigger, using, the same way that we can speed up the videos when we're watching videos. It's learning how to to accept that sometimes you have to slow these things down, and pressing pause and so on. And then he had another really good point, if you don't mind me just carrying on and chatting
Go
away,
for it.
Is how he then communicates that to others. Now, in the schools that I'm working with at the moment, we are developing and creating what we call like snapshot handovers. So it's a tiny little communication to be able to let other people know how it is that we work best. And so it's a completely non-judgmental, but it is a little something. And he could well do, if he doesn't mind, having just a little, it's like a business card that, hi, my name is such and such. This is what I do. I work best if you can call my name rather than tap me on the shoulder, or, look me in the eye if you want to get my attention for something, to make sure that I'm actually hearing what you're saying. So it's having a tiny little, whether it be a little flyer or a little business card, just a little something, because people won't know. People have no idea that you have these issues. And it's only when you're able to tell them that they will start to understand. And it's much better at least having a little bit of awkwardness until you get used to it, by saying, look, it would really help me if you could just have a look at that. And that's how if you communicate to me like this, then I'll be able to respond much better to you, or I'll be able to work better, be more productive in my office place. If these things were accommodated, and if you could do these certain things instead.
Because you went on, the bit you said was he struggles when there are certain phrases that people use, and he's like, I really struggle with that. And the one that he said was, we all have memory problems. And that's one that he really struggles with. And when people say that, it's like, well, yes, but no. So he was saying, have you got any thoughts around, I think you've answered some of that, but have you got any sort of thoughts around those sorts of issues?
Yeah, it would be validating that other person back, because it's really easy to get on the defensive. Oh, I tell you, when people say things and you think, oh, crumbs, you really don't get it. But we don't want to, show that back. We just accept that that's where the other person is at. So it was like, okay, yeah, I hear you. I understand that. But however, what it means for me is I find it hard when. So if there is a sense of don't hit back immediately, I'm sure you wouldn't. But it's just hearing that that's where the other people are at. Sometimes it's just have a deep breath and just walk away. So it's sometimes it's really not worth it, is it? But other times it's like, well, actually, I want to help this person to understand, because they actually are genuinely interested. They're just a bit clueless. They just don't know. So it would be, I hear that, but for me, it looks like this, and I would appreciate it. It really helps me if. But then he's got to know himself well and find and make sure that he has his own strategy so that he can actually communicate it. And that's a big part of normally what I do, is trying to help people work out and clarify for themselves what's helpful, so that they can then communicate it well to others.
Yeah, it's. I think sometimes it's that kind of awkward response on our own part. It's like, oh, how do I deal with this? So rather than being compassionate or understanding or helpful, we just sort of blurt out something that we think hopes will make that person know that we're compassionate, but it's not necessarily the right words, is it? Yeah,
or we're actually really annoyed at the other person. They're really not the right words.
Well, there's that. Could be a bit of both, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Right, let's move on to another one. This came in from someone. It's sort of three different questions here. So the interview is fascinating. This person really doesn't like getting things on their socks, like a piece of cereal or some crumbs. So he said that's clearly not a disorder. However, his daughter does struggle with sensory issues. When she was younger, she would change her clothes very frequently as she didn't like the feel of some of them. Is that something that you come across, or you might be able to help someone process better as a family?
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite classic. That's a weekly thing that I hear and that families struggle with. So yes, but we would also need to look at all of the other senses. So that is a typical tactile response. So it's their touch, what something feels like. Clothes are quite typical, same way that toothbrushing, getting the hair cut, because when you do cut the hair, the little bits of hair that are cut off, they settle lightly on the skin, and light touch is incredibly arousing. It's incredibly alerting, very dysregulating for some people. So that's why that sense of a crumb on their sock is just awful. And I have no doubt, I don't know if your listeners know The Princess and the Pea. It was an old story from my childhood, and that people used to see, and the princess would be able to identify, they put mattress upon mattress and mattress, and there was a pea at the very bottom. I bet she had sensory processing issues. I think that's where the story came from, because our individuals, whether it be children or adults, are picking up the slightest change, the slightest difference. And you'll get some people and they won't go to sleep at night because there's a crease in the bed sheets. And the pajamas have to be the certain temperature. Yeah, it goes on. So, but yes, there are things we could do. And we need to ideally assess all of the 7/8 senses to then work out the best way to actually treat that. But yeah, it is a very good and a very classic representation of having a sensory overreactivity to certain inputs. It's hard.
Yeah, it is. Let's move on. Another one. Question for your next interview. As a church, are there any simple steps that we could take to make services more accessible to those with sensory issues?
My first thing that I would love is for the questionnaire that is in it. It's christiansensorysupport.com/church. In there, it's a free program. There's a questionnaire, and it goes through the 7 senses. So it's asking the individual, do you have an issue with the sounds in church? And get them to describe it. Do you have an issue with the amount of time you're expected to sit still or to stand? You know, the kind of like all up and down kind of thing that we tend to do in churches. That's tricky for different reasons for different people. So I think absolutely the first thing would be to have a conversation. And I like it when it comes from the front. That if there is someone at the front who's able to say, we really want to hear any particular difficulties or struggles that you might have processing sensory information. And if people don't know it, well, in that case, it's definitely better to have a questionnaire and every member of the congregation gets one of these, so that nobody is singled out. And it's very interesting, the responses that will come back. But it's nice because you care for the whole flock in that way. But I think that communication to begin with, because you can't really address any needs well until you know what they actually are.
So you need information. You need to ask those questions, don't you? And be willing to have the answers that perhaps you don't even want to have. But that's the beginning of that help, isn't it?
Yeah. And it is amazing. It is quite hard. It's really hard when you get something back and you want to help and you don't know what to do. And that was where the program was developed, to give solutions. So if folks are okay with feeling uncomfortable, then that's a great place to start. It's not a nice place to start, but you'll only improve and get more confident in dealing with these issues the more you're exposed to them and the more you start trying things, and then you get the positive feedback for the individual that you're trying to help, and that builds confidence, and then it moves to the next person, and then another person is willing to come back to church. They haven't been in church for a while because of this, but they all of a sudden feel as though they are valued, they are heard, they do have a voice. And that genuinely people are willing to look at it now because actually there are some solutions. I
think I may have shared this one before, but I remember working in a church. We were doing some children's ministry, and there was one family, and one of their sons was very, very high on the autism spectrum. And he had sort of outbursts of shouting and not being able to sit still. And when they came to the church where we really worked with them alongside. And I said, well, how can we support you? And they were a bit shocked because no one had ever asked that question. They just feel awkward, make them feel awkward until they leave and they try and find another church. And we said, well, let's work. How can we work? What can we do? And for their particular situation, 2 of their children had no autism issues, and the one had very extreme ones. We provided a tent that was quite dark in a slight ante-room, and the child only went in there once, I think. And they said no one's actually bothered to want to work with us. But then they were feeling comfortable because once they were comfortable, the autism was less obvious because all of a sudden the child's more relaxed elsewhere, and it just snowballed. Oh, I've got some other friends. Can we invite them to the church as well? And you think, well, yeah, great, go for it. But it's asking that question, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's it. And what you were saying there with those, the stress levels, if they feel heard and understood, if there's a little bit of accommodation, all of a sudden they are able to cope. The arousal levels reduce, sensory sensitivities reduce, outbursts reduce, meltdowns reduce, all of it reduces. And that could be a slightest thing like having the potential of an opportunity of a tent. They may not want it. They may not use it all the time, but to know that someone has thought and that it is there if they do need it, that just really helps reduce the nervous system to a place where it can actually cope much better. So it's, that's lovely. Really lovely.
And the whole family relaxed and then everything got better. So it doesn't take a lot sometimes.
No, it doesn't take a lot. And that's the thing when it's like, especially when we are talking about churches, I have a real passion for families coming together and enjoying church. There is nothing compares to being able to fellowship with my children. That is the most important thing. That's the number one. That always has been the number one in my life. Everything that I do, what I choose to do, how I choose to do things. It's about how to have that connection with my boys, especially spiritually. So, and I think we all need that recharge for those who are coming from a faith base to have that recharge once a week. And people so often say, well, how can I recharge if I have my children with me? And it's like, with like, okay, no, we've got certain things we need to turn around and tweak around, because actually fellowship and worship is a family thing. But actually that's a big discussion to have as to different ways we can support families in different, according to what helps them on a Sunday and on a Sunday morning. But essentially, it's worship is a family thing, and that's how God designed it. So,
okay, let's move on. To be honest with you, there were times when my daughter was young that we just did not go to church. We were a Pentecostal church for a short time, so Pentecostal would be much louder, generally, lots more kind of loud singing and stuff, but for a short time. But the music was so loud, and the preacher got very passionate, overly passionate, that it was too much for my daughter to handle. We now have several Christian families with children who have autism who just avoid church altogether because it's too difficult. What would your response be for something like that?
Yeah. Okay, so we have the conversation first. Secondly, it's really interesting. Let's just focus on the auditory processing there, because that was the main thing that they picked up to begin with. The fact that it's too loud. Sometimes I would absolutely agree with that. And there's a conversation that needs to be had about how loud something needs to be. If something's over 90 decibels, especially if in certain churches the worship is longer than 30 minutes, you have something over 90 decibels and you actually damage the hair cells, and hair cells don't grow back, so that you're actually causing hearing loss. So I think it is a big thing for churches, even for church festivals, that we understand how God's made us, and actually the auditory system is really important, that we do protect it. So having really loud music is, I think, dishonoring to humanity, and isn't great. However, there's loud and there's loud. There is immersive auditory input, which is doesn't hit that same loudness, but it's really full. And you have sound that comes around the church, and it's really, it's a very, very full sound, but it's not a loud sound. So I think as churches, it's great we've got amplification, it's great we've got sound systems, but we do need to look at how we use them, and where the speakers are. I think there's things that we can learn for sure as to how to get the best auditory experience for everybody without it being overpowering. There are often also quieter spots in churches. So it might be down at the front or at the back to the left, or in a little portion of the church if you've got one of these older churches. So it's worth looking at the auditory environment so that you do a proper assessment. And that's part of the Sensory Healthy Church program, that there is an audit that you would go through to make you think that maybe people didn't think before. There might be a quieter place in the church that isn't as, you don't get it as strongly as you do in other places in the church. So that could be one thing as far as the environment's concerned. So it's either genuinely turning it down, and does it need to be as loud as it is, looking at the sound system and different ways of creating the sound system. finding different spots within the church. And then for the individual themselves, I often say that ear defenders are one of the best things ever. And the fact that they are now so widely accepted. And it's really cool. If you're a teenage lad and you've got your big headphones on, like, that is so cool. Like, nobody's going to bat an eyelid. And it's just if you have them for younger ones. And the girls have these lovely, lovely pink fluffy ones. Or, you could choose what ear defenders you want. Or you can have your little earplugs if necessary. It's a way, we do need to protect people and their auditory processing. It is a big one. It was definitely the biggest that came out in the church survey. Between that and movement, actually. It's noise. Noise is the biggie, and movement experiences as well. Was there something else in that question?
Over passionate preaching, and the music was so loud. And so there are children who don't attend. I remember I've done all age services in churches. It's one of the things I love to do when I can. But I'm always very conscious that there are people for whom that is difficult. And growing up, I watched the children's service was the one where the children didn't come, and people were saying, "Why not?" And even as sort of 15-year-old lad, I'm thinking it's because the children are bored and they're not engaged, or it's too loud, or it's too long, or it's language they don't understand. So it's like, is it any wonder the little ones don't come? Because then people kind of scowl at them, and they're making your children are making noise and all that kind of stuff. And actually, when I've done all age services, I get people saying, "Thank you. Actually, we felt like we were able to engage in part of the service."
Yeah.
So I think there are things that we can do, and quite a few times we've had. Particularly adults with additional needs, and the parents have come afterwards. "Thank you so much for engaging with my child." They never engage in a church service, but something that I was doing was doing that, and I just treat people like people.
Yeah,
that's the first thing that I do.
Absolutely, that's precious, absolutely precious. And the other thing, actually, that I was thinking about the auditory system. I mean, it's quite radical, and I've never actually seen it. So if there is a church that is doing it or that would like to start doing it, I talk about having these sound pods. So that actually there are these, they're glass, PVC or whatever you want, pods within the church. There are spaces that we can actually close off, but you can still see what's going on. They can move in there quite readily. You can pull a curtain if the individual inside the pod is going to be quite distracting for the rest of the congregation. So they're not put off, but they can move inside there. They can make their own noises. That's also another big thing. It wasn't just the noise that was coming from the front, but it was the fact that some of our individuals do need to shout. They do need to make little noises. They do need to verbalize and vocalize. So it's how can we do that? Yes, we could take them out of the service, and that's absolutely fine. And they can watch it on a screen outside. But also, if they want to be part of what is going on in the main sanctuary, in the main building, well, then you just get these little sound pods, these little 2 meters, 2, 3, 4 meter pods that you just construct out of UPVC, and it's there as a safe space, but it really dulls down the auditory input from enthusiastic preaching to the sound of the music, from the sounds from the congregation, and the sounds from the individual themselves. So they're still part of it. They just have these. I love the idea of seeing like lots of little pods of different sizes so that people can move and they can join in, but they're not distracting or they're not making noise and disturbing other people within the congregation.
I mean, we're talking about churches to some extent, but actually this can be applied to a business like a coffee shop. They could apply some of the same things of, well, that particular place is next to where you've got the coffee machine, and that's quite a piercing noise, or you've got cups coming out of the dishwasher, and that's traveling, because sound bounces in weird ways. This is not a great spot, so you might want to have a table in the corner. Well, this is actually the quietest part of our cafe.
Yes.
A little sign on it. If you're struggling with sensory issues, this might be a better spot, or just understanding those things.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I love. It just goes across the board. You start thinking sensory, and then you can just see how it applies to home, to work, to leisure, to clubs, to communication. I love it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I'm actually fascinated by two things I'm going to come back on actually before we finish. One was you said 7 or 8 senses, which I know we've chatted before, but that always jars in my head because I think there's only 5. So we'll come back to that one. And also you said 90 decibels is is a point at which we actually start to cause hearing damage. So that's actually something that's very easy to measure. I think you can get apps for phones now for decibels.
Yeah, you
that's
can.
An easy one to check.
Oh, it is. It has, like over the 30 minutes, I'm awful at doing that. I do have my app because it's just like, this is really, really important, guys. This is really important. So yeah, I have my app on, but I do it discreetly. I think it's more for information gathering at the moment because you have to be careful as to how you communicate it, but it is there. If that is over there for 30 minutes, it will hit. I think a lot of churches will hit the 90 decibels during the service. But if it is constantly at that for over 30 minutes, you will start to cause hearing damage.
All right. And then 8 senses. So just for people like me who think, I thought there was 5.
Okay. Okay, this is a test for everybody listening. All right, okay. So we've got sight. I'll do it in our typical language until we get onto the more complex ones. We've got sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. So auditory, olfactory, gustatory, visual, and tactile. There's our main 5. Now the other ones are proprioceptive system. That is information that comes from our muscles and our joints so that we can do things with our eyes closed and I can make little signs. I can't see what I'm doing, but I know what I'm doing because the information is going from my muscles and my joints to my brain and back. That also helps you do things behind your back. So if you can't do things behind your back, if you can't tie a bow, other things that happen behind your back, or if you're trying to comb your hair or do your hair, if you've got long hair, you need good proprioceptive integrity, proprioceptive awareness in order to be able to be quite dexterous and coordinated when you're not looking at what you're doing, so that you don't trip upstairs. So that you're able to actually kick a ball when you're actually looking down the field instead of looking where your leg is. That's all proprioceptive information. The vestibular system is based in the inner ear.
I've heard of that bit, I think.
And that's what it kind of like tells you every time your head moves, whether you tip it forwards or backwards or side to side, or if you spin or if you're upside down, you're stimulating the vestibular system, which is a massive, it's huge. It affects us in loads and loads of ways. At some point, we'll have time, hopefully, to explore that because it's quite profound in what it does to us as humans. But so if you've got somebody who is a spinner, a rocker, they're upside down, they're watching TV with their head on the sofa and their feet up on the wall, lots of things going on there. And then the final one is interoception, which isn't actually a sense. It is a group of senses. So that's often why I say 7/8, because we've got those 7 senses, those 5, the 5 that we normally know, with proprioception and vestibular. That's the 7, and we can use those for treatments. Interoception is the 8th group of senses, which combine all the internal senses. So when we know that we need the loo, when we need to go to the toilet, when we know that we are hungry or that we've had enough to eat, when we can feel our heart racing or not, we can feel the blood pumping through our veins, we can feel when we're out of breath. All of those experiences are picked up by our internal senses, our interoceptors, which sends the information to the brain. So you have some people who hate doing exercise because they can actually feel or just even walking down the street and they get a lot of blood pumping through their heart and they just don't like the feel of it. We have toileting accidents because maybe they're 7 years old, but they're still not able to recognize those toileting signals. And hunger. We've got those who just do not eat because they don't have those receptors saying that I'm really hungry now, and telling the brain that, and the brain is not perceiving it that way. So therefore they don't think to eat, or obviously the opposite way around. And then they're always eating because they don't have a sense of I am full or I've had enough. So.
Wow. Okay. So more than 5 senses. 7 plus, really.
7 plus, yeah, because there are many, many more after that. They're just the main ones that we focus on because they have the most impact on function and how we can actually treat them. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, it's really interesting as ever. The comments we're getting, people are saying, this is really fascinating stuff. This is really interesting to know. So thank you for being part of this.
That's great.
It's really encouraging to encourage other people, you know, and how can you live the better life as you are, who you are, where you are, in the environment that you have, rather than just feeling you've got to come away from everything and come away from life. How do we help you? And this is what I'm learning about this. So thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
As ever, thank you, Anne Laure Jackson. And we'll be back next week, all things being the same.